Usually when we talk about a map or like a historical timeline, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Right. Yeah, like it's an engineering schematic or something.
Exactly. You look at the borders of a state, let's take South Dakota, for example, and you see these clean, straight, just uncompromising lines.
Hmm.
You read a textbook, and the dates are just laid out, one after the other, perfectly sequential. And, I mean, it all feels so binary. It's comforting, really.
It is. It gives us this illusion that the ground beneath our feet has always been neatly categorized. We naturally like things to be visible, you know,
Yeah.
to have a definitive beginning and a definitive end.
Right, a clean narrative.
Exactly. But a map is really just a snapshot. It's a single frame taken at one specific millisecond of a very long, very chaotic movie.
But then you step into the world of deep history, right?
Okay.
Specifically the history of the land and the early inhabitants of what we now call South Dakota. And suddenly that modern map is entirely useless.
Oh, completely useless. The straight lines just vanish.
The neat categories dissolve. We're looking at a historical landscape that is constantly, relentlessly shifting under our feet.
It is the absolute definition of a dynamic, living chessboard. What we are looking at today is not just a snapshot of a few decades or even a few centuries of American pioneer history.
Right.
We are looking at an epic, sweeping narrative of human adaptation that stretches back, well, further than human civilization itself.
And that is exactly what we're doing today. So welcome to the deep dive. For you listening right now, we know your time is valuable. You want to cut through the noise.
Get straight to the actual mechanisms of history.
Yes, to get straight to those aha
Yeah.
moments, to understand the mechanics without drowning in academic jargon. So our mission today is a highly focused, in-depth exploration into the early inhabitants of the Great Plains.
And specifically, the epic, transformative rise of the Sioux Nation.
Exactly. And just so you know where we're pulling this from, we are basing our insights today on an extensive foundation of historical research. We're drawing heavily on comprehensive encyclopedic histories of the South Dakota region.
And to really grasp the magnitude of the history we are about to explore, we have to completely throw out our modern Western sense of time.
We have to zoom way, way out.
Right. We aren't just looking at the history of the United States. We aren't even just looking at the last 1,000 years. To understand the geopolitical and cultural reality of this region, we have to push back 17,000 years.
Wow, 17,000.
Yes. We are talking about 17 millennia of humans adapting to extreme environments, of vast trading empires rising and falling.
Massive technological arms races.
Exactly. And profound cultural transformations right there on the Great Plains.
Okay, let's unpack this. 17,000 years ago. To put that in perspective for you listening, human beings hadn't even figured out agriculture yet.
No, not even close.
The wheel was thousands of years away from being invented. The world is in the suffocating grip of the last ice age. Huge swaths of the northern hemisphere are buried under miles of glacial ice. And our research notes that it's during this incredibly hostile period that human beings first entered North America. They came via the Bering Land Bridge, that massive strip of exposed land that once connected Siberia to Alaska.
Because so much of the Earth's water was locked up in those massive glaciers, sea levels were drastically lower.
Oh, right, so it exposed the ocean floor.
Exactly. It created a temporary frozen highway. But it's vital to understand who these people were. These were not colonists looking to, set up towns or plant flags.
Right, they weren't building cities.
No. These were highly mobile, deeply resilient, nomadic hunter-gatherers. They were operating with what we would consider primitive Stone Age technology.
We're talking spears, atlatls, chipped flint.
Yes. And they were walking into an ecosystem that was fundamentally different from the Great Plains we know today.
And their entire existence was predicated on a very specific, very dangerous ecological reality. I mean, they were hunting large prehistoric mammals right there in the South Dakota area.
The megafauna.
Yeah. We are talking about Columbian mammoths, ancient giant ground sloths, prehistoric camels. I mean, just pause and picture that for a second.
It's hard to even conceptualize.
Imagine standing on the rolling plains of South Dakota, feeling the freezing wind coming off a distant glacier, and watching a herd of prehistoric camels or a massive, towering mammoth just walk by.
It sounds like science fiction, honestly, but it was the absolute reality of the Pleistocene epoch. And the mechanics of hunting these creatures with stone tools, it required an astonishing level of coordination.
And intelligence, right, because you don't just walk up to a mammoth and throw a rock at it.
No, you'd be crushed instantly. These early inhabitants had to perfectly understand the migratory patterns of megafauna. They had to use the landscape to their advantage.
Like driving them into natural traps?
Exactly. Perhaps driving these massive animals into bogs or, natural cul-de-sacs where their immense size actually became a disadvantage.
They get stuck in the mud.
Right. And their tools, like the beautifully crafted Clovis points, they were engineered specifically to pierce thick hides and cause maximum hemorrhaging.
But here's where it gets really interesting and honestly a little terrifying from a societal standpoint. The history of these early mammoth hunters is a masterclass in how fragile a specialized existence can be.
It truly is.
Because our research shows that this entire Paleolithic culture essentially vanished. They just disappeared around 5000 BC. And it wasn't an invading army that took them out.
No, it was an invisible enemy. Extreme climate change and ecological collapse.
Right.
As the Ice Age ended and the climate rapidly warmed, the whole environment shifted. The grasslands changed, the water sources moved, and the megafauna, the mammoths, the giant sloths, they just went extinct.
So their entire food source literally evaporated.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is the brutal lesson in vulnerability. These early inhabitants had built an entire culture, an entire technology tree, and an entire social structure calibrated perfectly to do one thing.
Hunt massive animals.
Yes. So when the mammoths died out, the culture built around hunting them simply could not sustain itself. They were too specialized.
If your entire economy, your tool making, your seasonal movements are tied to a resource that suddenly ceases to exist,
Your society collapses. It's a stark early reminder that the history of this land is defined by people constantly being forced to adapt to harsh, changing realities. You either adapt your technology and your diet, or you disappear.
wow. So the mammoth hunters fade into the archaeological record. Fast forward a few millennia, the climate stabilizes into something, closer to what we recognize today. And between the years AD 500 and 800, we see a totally new cultural expression emerge in eastern South Dakota. The historical records refer to them as the mound builders.
Right, and this is a significant shift in how humans are interacting with the landscape. These people lived primarily around the watershed of the Big Sioux River and Big Stone Lake.
Okay.
They were still hunters and gatherers living in temporary or maybe seasonal villages, but they did something the earlier mammoth hunters never did.
They built something permanent.
Exactly. They left a permanent, monumental mark on the earth. They constructed these low, massive earthen burial mounds.
And what's the significance of that? I mean, building a mound requires moving tons of earth by hand, right?
Yes, entirely by hand.
Yeah.
Without beasts of burden, without metal shovels. That requires a surplus of calories and a complex social hierarchy to organize the labor.
So they weren't just struggling to survive day to day anymore.
Precisely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, a burial mound is a declaration of presence. It's a way of anchoring a nomadic or semi-nomadic people to a specific geographic location.
It's like saying, we are here and our ancestors are here.
Yes. It represents a shared religious cosmology and a huge communal effort. And many of these mounds still exist today, just quietly sitting in the landscape.
But like the mammoth hunters, the mound builders' time in the region was limited too, right?
It was. By the year 800, they met their demise. The sources suggest it was likely through a combination of assimilation into other expanding groups or outright warfare.
Which brings us to another massive pivot point in the timeline. Between 1250 and 1400, a new wave of people arrives from the east.
Yes.
They settle in the central part of the state, and they bring a technology that completely alters the relationship between humans and the Great Plains, agriculture.
Right.
And our sources identify them as likely the ancestors of the modern Mandan people of North Dakota.
And the introduction of agriculture changes all the rules of the game.
Yeah.
We are moving away from pure hunter-gatherers to societies that can actually manipulate the earth to produce a predictable caloric surplus.
They're growing crops.
They are. And with agriculture comes permanent settlement. You have to stay near your fields to tend and harvest them, right?
You can't just plant corn and walk away for 6 months.
Exactly. But with permanent settlement and a surplus of stored food comes something else entirely.
Right.
A target.
Right.
You suddenly have resources that need to be aggressively defended.
And this is where I really want to push back on a narrative that is so prevalent today. There is this common modern misconception. You see it in movies, in romanticized popular culture, even in some classrooms.
Oh, absolutely.
There's this idea that pre-Columbian America was this sparsely populated, universally peaceful Eden, that before European contact, everyone just lived in perfect, tranquil harmony with nature and each other. But the archaeological reality completely shatters that myth.
It does. The romanticized version of history does a massive disservice to the actual human drama,
Yeah.
the complex geopolitics, the brutal realities of survival that unfolded here.
And there is perhaps no starker evidence of this than what occurred in the year 1325 near present-day Chamberlain, South Dakota.
The Crow Creek Massacre.
Yes. When you look at the archaeological excavation of this site, it is chilling. Our sources note they found 486 bodies buried in a massive mass grave.
Right, and this wasn't just a battlefield skirmish out on the open plains.
No. This mass grave was located inside a complex, heavily engineered fortification. They had built a massive defensive ditch and a wooden palisade wall.
A walled city, essentially.
And the skeletal remains. The forensic evidence shows horrific trauma, including undeniable evidence of systemic scalping and decapitation.
It is a profoundly grim archaeological site, but it tells us volumes about the mechanical reality of the 14th century Great Plains. Let's think about the logistics of this for a second.
Okay.
You don't expend the immense caloric energy required to dig a massive trench and fill hundreds of trees for a palisade wall unless you are deeply terrified of your neighbors.
Because digging a trench with bone and stone tools is incredibly hard work.
Unbelievably hard. You build walls because you have stored agricultural wealth, corn, beans, dried meat, and you know someone else wants it.
It makes me think of the rise and fall of ancient walled city-states in Mesopotamia, like Uruk or Babylon.
That's a great comparison.
We always visualize the plains as this wide-open, free-flowing space. But here, you have densely packed walled settlements, siege warfare, mass casualties, and brutal, intimate violence. It was a complex, highly populated, and fiercely contested landscape.
We have to ask why this massacre happened. Archaeological evidence from the bones at Crow Creek prior to the massacre shows signs of severe malnutrition.
Oh, really?
Yes. This suggests that the region was experiencing a prolonged drought or climatic downturn. When the crops fail and the bison herds thin out, the carrying capacity of the land drops.
So people get desperate.
Exactly. Suddenly, those stored reserves of food behind the palisade walls become a matter of life and death. The Crow Creek Massacre wasn't senseless violence. It was a devastating symptom of extreme resource scarcity and high-stakes competition for survival.
Wow. So out of this incredibly intense era of ancient agriculturalists and walled, warring settlements, we see the rise of complex, permanently settled trading empires. Which brings us to Section 2 of our deep dive, and a group that completely changes how I visualize the history of the plains. The Arikara.
Also known historically as the Ree. Our research notes they began arriving in the region from the south in the 16th century.
Okay.
Linguistically, they spoke a Caddoan language, which connects them to tribes like the Pawnee, and suggests they originally migrated up from what is now Kansas and Nebraska.
And here's the detail that just blew my mind. I'll admit it, when I hear 16th century Plains Indians, my brain immediately defaults to the classic Hollywood image.
Yes, horses.
Yeah, Tepethus, nomadic hunters following the buffalo herds, entirely transient. But the historical record explicitly states the Arikara were not highly nomadic.
Far from it. They were masterful engineers and urban planners of the plains. They lived in permanent, fortified villages, and these weren't small, temporary camps. They built massive, circular earthen lodges.
Let's talk about those earth lodges because the engineering is fascinating. How exactly do you build a permanent home on a prairie that experiences 100-degree summers and negative 30-degree winters?
It's a brilliant adaptation to the extreme climate. They would dig a shallow, circular depression into the earth.
Like a basement.
Exactly. Then they would erect a heavy wooden framework, usually utilizing 4 massive central posts. They would weave willow branches through the outer framework and then cover the entire immense dome with layers of prairie sod and earth.
So they basically built man-made, insulated caves.
Yes. The thermal mass of the earth meant that these lodges stayed incredibly cool in the brutal summer heat and retained warmth from a central fire during the freezing winters.
That's so smart.
Some of these lodges were large enough to house dozens of people, and even their most prized horses later on. And these villages were strategically placed. They were built on high bluffs overlooking the Missouri River, and they were heavily enclosed by wooden stockades.
It's like a prehistoric Venice or a Singapore of the plains. I mean, think about modern global supply chains. Singapore doesn't produce everything it sells, right?
Right, it's a hub.
It sits on a crucial geographic choke point, and taxes and trades everything that flows through it. That's exactly what the Arikara were doing. They are sitting in these heavily fortified permanent cities on the river bluffs.
And they were growing massive amounts of corn, beans, pumpkins, and squash in the fertile river bottoms.
But their real power, their real geopolitical leverage was trade.
Exactly. They operated as the elite, indispensable intermediaries of the continent. If a hunting tribe from the northern plains had excess bison robes or meat and wanted agricultural products, they came to the Arikara.
Okay.
If a southern tribe had distinct goods and wanted northern flint or later European trade items, they came to the Arikara. The Arikara essentially controlled the flow of goods along the Missouri River corridor.
They remained stationary in their highly engineered earth lodges, while the wealth of the continent literally walked to their front door.
And their political structure reflects that economic sophistication. They weren't a rigid top-down monarchy. The research describes a semi-autonomous political structure.
So they weren't all answering to one supreme king.
No, various sub-tribes and villages were connected in a loose, flexible alliance. This decentralized structure allowed them to be incredibly nimble in trade negotiations and local defense.
And it was through these vast, continent-spanning trading connections that one of the most transformative technologies in human history reached the region.
The horse.
Yes. The record suggests that the Arikara were instrumental in the initial spread of the horse. They acquired Spanish horses, which had been moving steadily north through tribal trade networks from Mexico and the American Southwest.
And they brought them to the South Dakota region around 1760.
By the 17th century, the Arikara were at the absolute peak of their power. They had as many as 32 of these massive fortified villages. They were an absolute powerhouse, dictating the terms of trade for hundreds of miles in every direction.
They were untouchable.
But then comes the fall, and it is swift, and it is devastating. By the late 18th century, those 32 thriving villages had dropped to just 2.
It's a staggering collapse.
And eventually, their numbers were so depleted that they had to abandon their independence and merge entirely with the Mandan to the north just to survive.
This steep collapse perfectly highlights the absolute fragility of empire and the double-edged sword of their lifestyle. The Arikara had everything going for them.
Fortifications, agriculture, monopolies.
Right. They had impenetrable fortifications against traditional weapons. They had sustainable high-yield agriculture, and they had a virtual monopoly on regional trade. But they were decimated by microscopic invaders.
Disease, the European pathogens that swept across the continent.
Specifically smallpox and cholera. And here's where we need to look at the mechanics of why it hit them so hard. A massive wooden fortress can easily keep out a rival war party, but it cannot keep out a virus.
Obviously not.
When a pathogen enters a dense, permanently settled village where people are living in close quarters inside earth lodges, the transmission rate is catastrophic.
Because everyone is trapped inside together.
Yes. In a dense population, a disease burns through the community like a wildfire. It is far more devastating to them than it is to a widely dispersed nomadic group that travels in small bands in the open air.
So their greatest strength, their permanent concentrated populations, and their position as a central hub where everyone came to trade actually became their greatest vulnerability. Every time a new trading party arrived, they risked importing a plague.
Exactly. Disease, combined with relentless military pressure from newly armed, expanding nomadic tribes who were less impacted by the plagues, broke the Arikara Empire.
Now, our research also brings up the sister tribe of the Arikara, the Pawnee, who likely inhabited a small portion of land in what is now the state. And there is a very specific historical detail recorded in the documentation about their cultural practices that is important to discuss objectively based on the source text. The historical records state that the Pawnee, along with the Arikara, engaged in a yearly religious ritual that involved human sacrifice.
Yes. Based purely on the historical documentation we are analyzing, this was a deeply ingrained annual religious practice. It was tied closely to their agricultural cycle, specifically regarding the morning star and the cultivation of corn.
And historical texts make a very specific note about the United States government's reaction to this practice as American influence began to creep westward.
Right.
The government worked actively to halt this ritual long before the Pawnee and Arikara homelands came to be heavily settled by white pioneers. And the reasoning provided in the text is purely logistical and optics-driven.
It wasn't framed as a moral crusade in these documents.
No. The government feared that if the general public back east heard about the practice of human sacrifice, they might react with horror and refuse to move westward to settle the newly acquired territories.
It is a profound, unvarnished collision of realities. What we are seeing recorded in the text is not just a moral debate. It is a clash of fundamental paradigms.
Okay, break that down.
On one side, you have a deeply entrenched religious cosmology of a Caddoan-speaking indigenous nation, where this ritual is viewed as essential for the survival of the cosmos and the success of the harvest.
Right, it's existential for them.
Exactly. On the other side, you have the calculated westward expansion strategies and public relations concerns of the 19th century United States government. The practices of the Pawnee were viewed by the expanding American government not just as alien, but as a direct logistical impediment to the project of mass white settlement.
It's laid out in the research as a stark historical mechanism, right? The power of an expanding nation-state suppressing the fundamental religious ritual of an indigenous society, driven heavily by the logistics and PR of colonization.
That's exactly what the text outlines.
And while the Arikara and Pawnee are dealing with these massive shifts, diseases, and external pressures, the documents remind us that the landscape was incredibly diverse. The text mentions the Iowa people and their sister nation, the Oto.
Yes, they inhabited the borderland region where modern South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa meet just north of the Missouri River.
And the linguistic detail here is the key that unlocks the next chapter of our story.
It really is. The research notes that the Iowa and Oto spoke Chiware.
Chiware.
Yes. This is a very old, distinct variation of the Siouan language family. It's linguistically tied to the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk people of Wisconsin.
Which perfectly sets the stage for Section 3 of our deep dive. Because while the Arikara trade empire is buckling under the weight of disease and shifting trade routes on the plains, an entirely different group of people is being violently forced out of the dense eastern woodlands.
Setting off a massive chain reaction.
Exactly. And this migration is going to set off a geopolitical chain reaction that completely rewrites the history, the culture, and the map of the North American continent.
We're talking about the genesis, the rapid evolution, and the explosive rise of the Sioux.
By the 17th century, the historical texts tell us the Sioux, who, as their name suggests, spoke a language of the Siouan family, were deeply settled in what is today central and northern Minnesota.
Right, way further east than most people picture them.
Yeah. They were woodlands people, divided into two primary culture groups at this time, the Dakota and the Nakota. They harvested wild rice, they hunted deer in the forests, they navigated the lakes in canoes.
A completely different lifestyle.
But by the early 18th century, something massive shifts. They begin moving south and west, abandoning the deep woodlands and spilling out onto the open plains.
And we have to analyze the mechanics of why an entire civilization abandons its ancestral homeland. This wasn't a casual exploratory migration.
People don't just pack up and leave for no reason.
Exactly. The sources point to two main drivers. First, there was the pull factor. Greater food availability to the west, specifically the vast, unimaginable herds of bison.
But there's a push factor too, right?
Yes, and the push factor is much more urgent and violent. They were facing a severe existential military disadvantage.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and where the popular narrative gets completely inverted. Are the sources saying that the legendary, nomadic, fiercely independent horse culture of the Plains Sioux, the culture that becomes the absolute archetype of the American West, was actually born because they were refugees fleeing a technological arms race in the Great Lakes?
That is precisely what the historical record indicates. It was an arms race fueled by global colonial economics.
Wow.
The rival Ojibwe and other related Algonquian tribes living to the east of the Sioux had established lucrative, direct trade relations with the French Empire.
The fur trade.
Right. And through that fur trade, the Algonquian tribes obtained European firearms, muskets, and rifles. The Sioux, who were further inland and lacked that direct trade access, were still entirely reliant on traditional bows, arrows, and clubs.
Let's break down that tactical disadvantage. In the dense, heavily wooded environment of northern Minnesota, an ambush with early firearms is devastating.
It changes everything.
The noise, the smoke, the sheer kinetic impact of a lead ball compared to an arrow, it completely changes the math of woodland warfare. The research mentions a poorly understood but highly disruptive and violent conflict between Siouan and Algonquian peoples in the early 18th century. The Sioux were quite literally outgunned, they couldn't hold their territory against musket fire, and it forced a massive tactical retreat westward.
And what happens next is a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. They move west into the prairies, and it fundamentally entirely alters their civilization.
It's a complete 180.
They go from being a largely settled eastern woodlands people, navigating lakes in canoes, to becoming the apex nomadic civilization of the northern plains.
The speed and totality of this transformation is staggering to think about. Let's look at the mechanical characteristics of this adaptation that our sources outline. First, their diet and economy completely shift to a near-total dependence on the bison.
Right.
The bison provided not just meat, but bone for tools, sinew for bowstrings, stomachs for water vessels, and hides for clothing and shelter.
A walking supermarket, essentially.
Second, and most crucially, they undergo an equestrian revolution. They adopt the horse. And remarkably, the text notes they were introduced to the horse by the Cheyenne tribe.
And mastering the horse is not a simple task. You are taking a people who have walked or paddled for thousands of years, and suddenly they have to learn to breed, train, ride, and fight from the back of a massive, flight-oriented prey animal.
It's a completely alien skill set.
It really is. But the horse exponentially expanded their hunting radius. A hunter on foot might track a herd for days to get a single kill. A hunter on horseback can ride alongside a stampeding herd and kill multiple bison in minutes. It created an incredible caloric surplus.
And the third massive adaptation is architectural. The adoption of the tipi. We tend to look at the tipi just as a tent, a simple piece of fabric on some sticks.
Right, a very reductive view.
But when you examine it through the lens of this rapid societal adaptation, the tipi is a highly advanced, flawlessly engineered piece of survival technology.
Let's analyze the engineering of a tipi. They left behind their semi-permanent, heavy woodland lodges for something completely aerodynamic.
Because there's no windbreaks on the plains.
Exactly. The conical shape of a tipi is specifically designed to shed the brutal 60-mile-an-hour straight-line winds of the Great Plains without collapsing.
And it solves the temperature problem, too. They have adjustable smoke flaps at the top, which create a draft, allowing you to have a safe, open fire inside the shelter during a blizzard without suffocating from the smoke.
Exactly. And it is hypermobile. A tipi could be disassembled by the women of the tribe in a matter of minutes.
Wow, minutes.
Yes. The lodge pole strapped to the sides of a horse to create a drag sled called a travois, and the entire village could be on the move, chasing a migrating bison herd before the morning was over.
That's incredible.
It is a masterclass in societal adaptation. In a remarkably short window of time, just a few generations, the Sioux changed their geographic environment, their primary food source, their mode of transportation, their architecture, and their military tactics. They weaponized mobility.
That's a brilliant way to phrase it. They weaponized mobility. The very thing that forced them out of Minnesota being outmaneuvered and outgunned by rifle-wielding rivals in a statid environment turned them into the undisputed masters of the Great Plains. Once they had horses in the open prairie, traditional infantry tactics were useless against them. They grew so powerful that population boomed so much from the bison surplus, and their territory expanded so rapidly that the original group actually fractured. The text describes a massive societal schism once they were established on the plains.
Yes, the vast distances and differing local ecologies caused the original unified groups to divide into three separate distinct nations.
Okay, let's break those down.
You have the Lakota, who pushed the furthest west. They crossed the massive barrier of the Missouri River around 1760 and reached the Black Hills by 1776, establishing dominance over western South Dakota, northwestern Nebraska, and southwestern North Dakota.
Then you have the Assiniboine. Interestingly, their path diverged completely. They actually migrated back eastward toward their ancestral homelands in Minnesota. And then you have the remaining Sioux in the central regions. The text notes that around this time, the Dakota people rose to become politically and culturally more prominent than the Nakota, to the point where the entirety of this central group largely adopted the Dakota identity.
And we must deeply emphasize the geopolitical ripple effect of this massive Sioux expansion. History is physics. For every action, there is a reaction. The Sioux weren't migrating into a vacuum. The text clearly states that due to the sheer kinetic force of the Sioux migrations, a number of other established tribes were violently displaced from the region.
It's a domino effect, though. Ojibwe pushed the Sioux push everyone else.
Exactly. The Cheyenne, who, in a bitter irony of history, had been the ones to introduce the Lakota to the horse in the first place, were completely pushed out of their territory and driven further west.
Well, that is ironic.
The Arikara, already weakened by smallpox, were forced to abandon their southern outposts and retreat further north along the Missouri River. And the Omaha tribe was driven completely out of southeastern South Dakota, forced southward into northeastern Nebraska.
But the story of the Sioux doesn't end in fragmentation. They divide, they conquer, but then they evolve politically.
Right.
The text notes that later on, the Lakota and the Assiniboine returned to the diplomatic fold. They reunited with the Dakota to form a single, massive, incredibly complex political confederacy known as the Aseti-Sakowin, or the Seven Council Fires.
To understand the Aseti-Sakowin, you have to discard the European idea of a centralized nation-state with a single king and a capital city.
It wasn't an empire in the Roman sense.
No, this was a highly sophisticated, decentralized political confederacy designed for a nomadic civilization. It was culturally divided into four main groups: the Lakota, the Dakota, the Nakota, and the Nagoda.
And within those, there were subdivisions, right?
Yes. Within those broader cultural umbrellas, there were 7 distinct autonomous tribes, each operating under their own chiefs and internal councils.
The sources list them out specifically. We have the Wahpeton, the Dakota Santee and the Sisseton, the Nagoda Yankton and Yanktonai, and the massive Lakota Teton. And right here, buried in the demographic breakdown, there is an incredibly deep, nerdy linguistic detail in the text about the Nakota tribe that I just have to talk about.
Oh, the translation error.
Yes, because it perfectly illustrates how fragile historical memory is. If you look in many standard history books, you will see the Nakota of this region referred to as the Nakota Mdewakan. But the source text points out that this name is actually a massive historical hallucination.
Yes, it stems from a fundamental error in early European attempts to transcribe the spoken Lakota language into a written alphabet.
Right. The text explains the mechanics of the mistake. Early translators and missionaries, struggling to capture sounds that didn't exist in English or French, mistakenly transcribed the Lakota bilial sound as an MD.
It seems like a tiny phonetic slip, but the ripple effects are huge.
Right, because once it's written down, it becomes fact.
Exactly. For example, the Lakota word for summer is balokektu. Because of this transcription error, it was widely misprinted in dictionaries and texts as makatu.
And because of this widespread systemic translation error, the tribal name Mdewakan is actually a complete misprint that just stuck. The historical text states that properly, based on their own linguistic pronunciation, they should be known as the Belowakan.
It's a striking, almost sobering reminder of how history is literally shaped by the people holding the pen.
Literally a typo. A simple phonetic misunderstanding by a sweaty, confused 18th century European translator gets cemented into the permanent historical record, and generations of people end up calling a tribe by a name that is essentially a typo.
It raises a vital question for anyone studying history. What else has been skewed, simplified, or entirely erased in translation?
That's a scary thought.
But if we pull back and connect this linguistic nuance to the bigger picture, the Aseti-Sakowin, the Seven Council Fires, was an incredibly effective, continent-spanning geopolitical entity. In this unified form, the text notes they were powerful enough to eventually secure from the United States government a legally recognized sovereign homeland.
Which was called the Minnesota Makoche, or the Lakota Republic.
Yes, they weren't just a collection of roaming bands, they were a bona fide superpower.
They were dictating the movement of other nations, controlling thousands of square miles of territory, regulating the immense wealth of the Buffalo Plains.
They functioned as a sovereign power fully capable of forcing the United States to the negotiating table.
Which perfectly sets the scene for Section 5, the inevitable clash of expanding nations. As we cross into the early 19th century, the geopolitical board changes overnight. In 1803, the United States, under President Thomas Jefferson, executes the Louisiana Purchase,
Buying a massive tract of land from Napoleon Bonaparte for $11 million.
which is an incredibly arrogant transaction when you think about it. Two men in Paris and Washington exchanging money for land that neither of them have ever seen.
And that is currently occupied and controlled by the most powerful military confederacy on the continent.
Exactly. The U.S. essentially buys a piece of paper, but they have absolutely no idea what is actually out there. So Jefferson organizes the Lewis and Clark expedition, the core of discovery, to launch in 1804 and figure out exactly what they just bought.
Their mission, according to the official parameters recorded in the text, was multifaceted. They were to follow the Missouri River to its source, find a navigable water route to the Pacific Ocean, take extensive cartographic and scientific surveys of the flora and fauna.
And crucially, establish diplomatic and trade relations with the indigenous tribes they encountered.
Right. They left St. Louis in May of 1804 with a heavily armed contingent of 45 men and 15 tons of supplies loaded into 3 boats.
And they were just slowly fighting the fierce current of the Missouri until they reached the South Dakota region in late August.
And the sources provide some incredible, very human details from this leg of the journey. For instance, near present-day Vermilion, South Dakota, Lewis and Clark actually anchored their boats and hiked inland to a specific geological formation called Spirit Mound,
Why?
because they had heard local indigenous folklore that the mound was inhabited by aggressive little spirits or devils armed with tiny arrows.
That's fascinating. It shows that they weren't just mapping rivers. They were trying to navigate and catalog the mythic and spiritual geography of the plains just as much as the physical terrain.
And their physical diplomatic encounters were equally varied and complex. The text documents that they had a very peaceful, highly ceremonial meeting with the Yankton Sioux further south. Gifts were exchanged, speeches were made, and it fit the neat narrative of peaceful diplomacy.
But then they went further north.
Yes. However, as they pushed further north up the river, their encounter with the heavily armed Lakota Sioux was an entirely different story. It was incredibly tense, volatile, and nearly ended the expedition right then and there.
And this is exactly where I want to push back on how standard American history usually frames this event. If you read a standard middle school textbook, Lewis and Clark are presented as the main characters of the continent.
Always.
They are boldly and bravely discovering an open wilderness. But reading this source text, a completely different, much more realistic picture emerges. Through the eyes of the Lakota, Lewis and Clark weren't heroic explorers.
No, not at all.
They look like a small, poorly manned, peculiar group of unauthorized traders trying to sneak through the heavily controlled borders of a massive empire without paying the toll.
That is the most accurate geopolitical reading of the situation. The Lakota were the dominant power, the Missouri River was their highway, and they controlled who moved on it.
So they weren't just randomly unpacking them.
The text explicitly states that the Lakota initially mistook the American party simply for another group of traders. They viewed the expedition entirely through an economic and regulatory lens. They demanded tribute for passing through sovereign Lakota waters.
Let's paint the picture of this standoff. It happens in late September near the mouth of the Bad River. The language barrier is massive. They're trying to communicate through a chain of inadequate translators.
Which just breeds paranoia.
Right. Tensions skyrocket. At one point, the Lakota warriors physically seize the mooring cable of the American boat and steal a horse. Lewis, furious and panicking, orders his men to man the swivel guns on the boats and prepare to fire.
The Lakota warriors string their bows and draw their arrows.
You have this incredibly fraught standoff on the muddy banks of the Missouri. It appeared the Lakota were fully prepared to violently delay or completely halt the expedition.
It was a knife's edge moment. But ultimately, through intense last-minute diplomacy by a Lakota chief named Black Buffalo, the weapons were lowered.
They stood down and eventually allowed the Americans to pass.
But the takeaway is crucial. It wasn't random, savage hostility. It was border control.
Right.
You have a superpower, the Sioux Confederacy, encountering uninvited, heavily armed foreign agents moving up their most vital economic waterway. The core discovery didn't boldly march through an empty wilderness. They had to walk an incredibly delicate diplomatic tightrope through foreign territory.
Exactly. And the sources point out that Lewis and Clark were constantly mediating regional politics as they moved. The text notes that further north, the expedition actively acted as diplomatic mediators between the warring Arikara and Mandan tribes.
They were trying to establish an American-brokered peace to facilitate future trade.
Lewis and Clark were stepping into a deeply complex, pre-existing geopolitical web that had been spinning for centuries.
But the mutual recognition of these tribal borders, and later formal treaties recognizing entities like the Lakota Republic, would ultimately buckle.
Which brings us to Section 6.
Right. As we move into Section 6 of our deep dive, the 19th century grinds on, and the feared demographic and industrial weight of American westward expansion becomes an overwhelming, unstoppable force.
The sources outline a tragic, systematic, and entirely predictable dissolution of every agreement made between the United States and the Sioux. In the decades leading up to the Civil War, the pressure valve bursts.
Steamboats are coming up the river, wagon trains are cutting across the hunting grounds.
Conflicts inevitably increased between the fiercely protective Sioux and the encroaching American citizens. And the text points the finger squarely at a severely poorly funded, disorganized, and corrupt Bureau of Indian Affairs.
It was fundamentally incapable of honoring its obligations or keeping the peace.
The logistics of the treaties were flawed from the start. The U.S. government made promises of rations and border enforcement that it either couldn't or wouldn't keep.
As starvation set in and patience wore thin, violence erupted. Eventually, utilizing the outbreak of violence as justification, the United States blamed the Sioux for various atrocities against settlers.
And unilaterally rendered the treaties recognizing the sovereign nation of Lakota completely null and void.
It initiates a relentless cascade of shrinking boundaries. In 1858, under immense political and military pressure, the Yankton Sioux are forced to sign the Treaty of Washington.
And what did that do?
This document legally cedes the vast majority of present-day eastern South Dakota to the United States government.
And the moment the ink is dry, land speculators, railroad tycoons, and pioneers immediately rush in to claim the best riverfront property. They found early colonial cities like Sioux Falls and Yankton.
The eastern half of the state was gone, but the western half of present-day South Dakota was a different story, at least temporarily.
Right, because of another treaty.
The text states that the subsequent Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 had formally granted this massive western area, including the spiritually and economically vital Black Hills, to the Sioux as part of the Great Sioux Reservation.
The treaty explicitly stated that the land was theirs in perpetuity, and that no white persons would be permitted to settle or pass through without permission.
In perpetuity until 1874.
That is the flashpoint. That's when the U.S. government, dealing with a severe economic depression and hungry for capital, authorizes General George A. Custer to lead a heavily armed military expedition straight into the heart of the Black Hills.
Which, again, the text firmly notes was strictly treaty-protected land granted to the Sioux.
Custer's men discover gold. And once the word gold hits the telegraph wires, the treaty is effectively dead.
The mechanics of a gold rush destroy borders instantly. The text is very clear on the sequence of legal and physical events here. The U.S. government initially attempted to purchase the Black Hills.
But the Sioux said no.
The Sioux, viewing the land as sacred and non-negotiable, adamantly declined to grant mining rights or sell the land.
So legally, the U.S. was obligated by the Treaty of Fort Laramie to forcefully remove any American citizens trespassing on the reservation.
But practically, the military largely failed, or refused, to stop the massive flood of heavily armed white miners, prospectors, and settlers from illegally pouring into the region.
I mean, how do you stop 10,000 desperate men with pickaxes? You don't. And according to the historical documents we are reviewing, this blatant failure by the United States to uphold its own treaty borders directly inevitably led to the outbreak of the Great Sioux War of 1876.
This is the war that includes the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Custer is killed.
But despite that tactical victory for the Sioux, the strategic reality of the war was devastating. The result was the total military defeat of the Sioux Confederacy and their forced placement onto drastically reduced, strictly controlled reservations within South Dakota and North Dakota.
And the political pressure for land didn't stop once they were confined to the reservations. It only intensified. The research highlights a specific event in 1889.
Okay, what happened then?
President Benjamin Harrison sent General George Crook with a federal commission to persuade the Sioux to sell off fully half of their remaining reservation land.
Because the driving political belief in Washington was that the newly minted state of South Dakota wouldn't be economically viable or attractive to immigrants unless it controlled that land.
Exactly. And the text uses a very specific loaded phrase here to describe how General Crook managed to get the Sioux to sign away millions of acres of their last remaining territory. It states, and I quote, that he used dubious methods to secure the agreement.
Okay, to unpack what dubious methods means in the context of late 19th century Indian affairs, it generally involved exploiting the desperation of the tribes.
It meant bypassing recognized tribal leaders to find individuals willing to sign, forging signatures, making impossible promises.
And most coercively, threatening to withhold life-saving federal food rations from a starving population unless they agreed to the land cessions.
It was bureaucratic extortion. Which brings the historical timeline to its darkest, most tragic point, December 29, 1890, and the Wounded Knee Massacre on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation.
The text notes this was the last major armed conflict between the United States and the Sioux Nation.
It is essential to recount the facts of Wounded Knee exactly as they are documented, without embellishment, because the reality is horrifying enough on its own. The U.S. 7th Cavalry had intercepted a band of Miniconjou Lakota under Chief Spotted Elk. The military's objective was to disarm the Lakota and move them to a different camp. During the tense process of confiscating weapons, a rifle discharged.
And the response from the U.S. troops, who had surrounded the camp with rapid-fire Hotchkiss mountain guns, was overwhelming and indiscriminate.
The numbers recorded in the text are devastating. The massacre resulted in the deaths of approximately 300 Sioux.
And the demographic breakdown is the most chilling part. A vast number of the dead were unarmed women and children who were fleeing the camp. In the ensuing chaos and crossfire, 25 U.S. soldiers were also killed.
It is the stark, brutal culmination of decades of broken treaties, cultural suppression, and an insatiable American appetite for land. But the historical documents we are reviewing today don't just end the story in the blood and snow of 1890.
They trace this profound legal and moral conflict directly into the modern era.
Yes, the text notes that the Sioux never stopped fighting for their rights to the Black Hills. They just moved the battlefield to the American court system.
Right. And after nearly a century of stalled litigation and failed lawsuits, a landmark decision is reached.
Tell us about that.
The text states that in the 1980s, specifically the 1980 Supreme Court case, United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians, the highest court in the land officially recognized and ruled that the United States government was entirely at fault.
The court ruled that the taking of the Black Hills was illegal and violated the Fifth Amendment,
Stating essentially that a more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealings will never, in all probability, be found in our history.
So if we step back and ask, what does this all mean for us today? It means that the legal frameworks drafted in the 1860s and 1870s, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the illegal Custer Expedition, the dubious methods of General Crook, they are not just dusty history.
They are the active, unresolved legal and social realities of the 20th and 21st centuries.
The Supreme Court awarded the Sioux over $100 million in compensation for the stolen land. But the Sioux refused to take the money, arguing that accepting the payout would legally validate the theft of their sacred homeland.
And the text explicitly concludes this deeply complex section by noting that despite the Supreme Court officially recognizing the government's fault and illegal actions, very little has actually been done practically or politically to smooth the issue over to the best interests of both sides.
The Black Hills remain heavily populated and heavily mined, and the Sioux remain on the reservations.
The legal victory exists on paper, but the physical reality of the landscape remains unchanged. It is a profound, lingering stalemate.
It really is incredible.
When you look at it all laid out, when you take the time to really examine the mechanics of how we got here, the journey for you, the listener, today has been massive. We started 17,000 years ago, standing on a freezing glacier, watching early humans track giant megafauna across the Ice Age plains.
We saw the engineering marvels and the rapid collapse of the Arikara trade empires, fortified in their earth lodges.
We tracked the breathtaking, lightning-fast transformation of the Sioux, pushed out of the eastern woodlands by European rifles, mastering the horse, engineering the tipi, and rising to absolutely dominate the Great Plains.
We watched Lewis and Clark navigate the tense borders of a sovereign indigenous superpower.
And finally, we traced the tragic, complex, legally fraught physical conflicts over the Black Hills that continue to echo loudly in the Supreme Court and on the reservations today.
It is a history defined by one constant: relentless, unforgiving change. The environment changes, the technology changes, the balance of power changes. And reviewing this epic sweep of human adaptation leaves me with a final thought, a perspective based entirely on the sources we've examined today.
What's that?
If a single landscape can completely change hands, shift cultures, adopt new technologies, and speak different languages so many times over the course of 17,000 years, what does that mean for our modern maps?
Oh, wow.
We tend to view the borders drawn today, the states and the nations, as permanent ink. We look at the straight, clean lines of South Dakota on a globe and think they are eternal. But the deep history of the Great Plains suggests that those borders are far more fragile. They are less like permanent ink and more like lines drawn in the sand, just waiting for the wind to blow.
Wow. Lines in the sand. That completely changes how I look at a map and how I understand the ground I'm standing on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into these incredible historical sources. Keep questioning the neat narratives, keep looking past the binary, and always stay curious.